Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Todd Huizinga, Director of International Outreach at the Acton Institute, whose 20-year career in the U.S. Diplomatic Corps included stints as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Luxembourg, Political Counselor at the U.S. Mission to the European Union in Brussels, and Consul for Political and Economic Affairs at the U.S. Consulates in Hamburg and Munich. Todd, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Bill. Glad to be here.
Todd, I just finished reading your new book, The New Totalitarian Temptations, Global Governance and the Crisis of Democracy in Europe. It's an insightful firsthand account of a career diplomat who's worked at many embassies across the EU, and I have to say, I haven't read anything so chilling in a long time. I mean, it's one thing to face the prospect of conquering armies or even insane terrorists, but it's quite another to be given a look behind the scenes at a bureaucratic elite literally trying to take over the world by stealth. I'm sure your expose will become a must-read, and I asked you on to take us through it concept by concept. So let's start here. We've seen the results of hard utopian ideologies in practice, from the gulags of the Soviet Union to the Cultural Revolution in Maoist China. What is the EU's soft utopian ideology of global governance?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Bill, for that question. The soft utopian ideology of global governance is basically the belief that by developing an ever greater web of international organizations that administer an ever greater body of international law, you can do away, in a certain sense, with the rivalry between nation states, and you can achieve a post-national world order in which there is much less reason for conflict between nation states, much less war, basically peace, prosperity, and stability. And it's utopian because it's not going to happen.
So you've pointed out that global governance is not one world government. What's the difference?
Well, global governance ideology does not seek to do away, per se, with the nation states. It simply seeks to lessen the sovereignty of each nation state by subjecting countries to international law and international organizations. It's the idea that if you have people thinking at a global level, the experts, so to speak, you're going to do away with parochial interests and thus reach a higher level of peace. I mean, it has a lot to do with kind of networks and non-governmental actors such as businesses and nonprofits and academics and so forth also having a say in power. So it's actually much more complex and that thus much more difficult to understand and thus in a certain sense much more insidious than a one world government, which is kind of an easy to understand conspiracy theory. This is much more complex and in a certain sense much more realistic because we already do have all kinds of global networks of people working together.
Well, it doesn't sound so scary so far, but how will elected officials slowly become replaced by educated professionals? And what does this say for the future of democracy?
Well, I think that the key to this is, in the sense of replacing democracy, is that somehow global interests are defined as in the interest of everyone, and thus local interest, in other words, people's real lives, are kind of denigrated as if they were not relevant or were somehow illegitimate. It forgets the fact of people's real lives, that people live in a local situation, in a local community, within families, etc., within nations and cultures that do have their own legitimate interests, and that real international relations is balancing the legitimate national interests of different peoples, that there really is no global interest. What you have in global governance is kind of the manufacturing of a so-called global interest in the real interest of people who want more power for themselves and believe that they know better about how to regulate the world.
So this makes it easy to ignore things like the total devastation of Greece caused by the introduction of the euro.
Yes. The key to the euro that I think is really important to understand the phenomenon is that the euro was not an economic decision. It was not an economic decision to introduce the euro. It was a political decision. The euro was introduced because the globalists, so to speak, within the European Union wanted to politically unify Europe. It wasn't working via democratic channels because European peoples did not want political union. Italians wanted to be Italians, Germans, etc. And so they introduced this common currency, thinking that a common currency would make a common budget necessary, a common tax policy necessary, and thus a common government necessary. The common government didn't happen, and the result was the inevitable disaster of trying to unify the economies of countries at radically different levels of productivity and development.
Todd, you point out that strategic vagueness is important in executing the EU plan, and you describe something called the Monet Method. What's that all about?
Jean Monnet, a Frenchman, was the principal intellectual architect of European Union. He was the person who was there at the beginning when the European Coal and Steel Community was founded a few years after World War II. And he wanted a unified Europe. He wanted to overcome the conflict between European nation states. But he knew that wouldn't be politically acceptable to people. So he came upon the incremental strategy of, one, hooking things at first to the economy and not to politics, and two, not going beyond each incremental step so that each incremental step would not be politically unacceptable.
It's the old slowly boiling the frog method.
Absolutely, that's it. That's correct.
You say that anti-Americanism is an inevitable growth of the European idea. Why?
The European idea is an idea that believes that it has gone beyond international relations among nation states to a globalist world order in which nation states pool their national sovereignty and thus give up a lot of their national sovereignty. The United States is the big gorilla in the room that is the only remaining world power and that believes in its national sovereignty. And thus the very existence of the United States stands in the way of the European elite realizing its globalist dream.
Do you think President Obama has bought into this vision of the European idea?
There are many, many similarities between the left in the United States and the globalists in Europe. And I think that many Americans on the left have bought into this dream and that they believe that the United States is too powerful, that the United States uses its power inevitably in negative ways, and that we need to rely on the international community more in order to reach peace. But I don't think that most Americans, even on the left, realize how far it goes in Europe and the fact that they've already created a model of this post-nation-state world in the European Union and that there's no democratic accountability.
You covered so many topics in your book. We can't hit them all here, but you did call the EU post-Christian in that the vision of supranational governance is filling a void left by the loss of faith. What did you mean by that?
Well, everyone needs hope. And in a society that still holds to a religion, or at least to a religious tradition, as the United States does, even though the United States seems to be secularizing more and more, that hope is generally provided for by religion, by faith. Europe is, to a large extent, a post-Christian continent in which fewer and fewer and fewer people are practicing their former Christian faith, the continent's former Christian faith. And into that void, we have politics. If you don't have faith in religion, then you need to put your faith somewhere. And in Europe, for many people, especially for the elites, that faith has come to mean politics, has come to mean building a new, peaceful world that's better than this world, that somehow redeems us from the wars and the pain and the suffering of this world.
Todd, in your new book, The New Totalitarian Temptations, Global Governance and the Crisis of Democracy in Europe, you state that the common currency, the euro, was adopted not despite the fact that it was known to be unsustainable without political integration, but because of that fact. You mentioned that earlier in the program. How's that playing out?
Well, it's playing out very badly, as we can see in Greece and other countries. When you have the situation where you have completely different economies, completely different levels of productivity and development with a common currency, and you have a crisis, what that means is that the weaker countries, such as Greece, do not have any means of kind of restoring the balance by changing their exchange rate, by devaluing their currency. Currency devaluation is not an option because Greece and Germany, for example, share the same currency. The only way to try to restore that balance and keep the common currency is by internal devaluation, namely lowering wages and increasing productivity in order to get your economy producing at a rate that's kind of in balance with the other countries that share your currency. And that's a very, very painful thing and has caused in Greece, Spain, Italy, the weaker countries economically of Europe, has caused very, very high unemployment, misery, and a lot of discontent.
You know, speaking of that, to anyone with a brain in their heads, the European Central Bank looks to be spinning out of control. I mean, they've gone from QE to zero interest rate policy to negative interest rate policy, and now they're talking up a ban on cash. I mean, all of this was supposed to be in the name of stimulating economic growth, but that's come to a complete halt. You've mentioned the collapse in Greece. I mean, unemployment among youth in Europe has reached Great Depression levels. How long can they keep this up before the euro cracks?
That is the question. This situation is unprecedented, and so we don't know what's going to happen. But I can say that there's no plausible scenario in which Greece will ever be able to pay back its debts. There continues to be conflict between Greece and its creditors in terms of Greece fulfilling the stipulations of the creditors for getting the money that it needs, and Greece not wanting to do that because it's politically very, very difficult to keep imposing this internal devaluation, lowering of wages, putting people out of work, cutting expenditures, social expenditures, and so forth. It's a situation that seems to be intractable, and so far really has been intractable.
Who's running Greece right now? Is it the Greek government or is it the EU?
You know, when the Greeks elected this current leftist government, they basically were trying to reassert their own sovereignty. The Greek people were trying to reassert their right to elect a government that serves their interests as they perceive them. And so in a certain sense, it's hard to blame the Greeks for electing the far-left government. They're simply trying to say, look, we want a government that serves Greek interests and not EU interests. The fact remains, however, that Greece's economic policy and taxation policy and all of those other things that affect everyday lives of Greek is basically being dictated by the European Union.
Todd, the Paris Climate Treaty is the latest example of the EU's attempt to create a supranational regulatory regime. President Obama knows he can't get it approved by the Senate, but he plans to sign it anyway. Is this another example of the Monet Method you spoke about earlier?
Well, I think the treaty itself is an example of a different twist on the Monet Method, and that is, rather than in the traditional Monet Method having a policy of incremental change in which you're very vague about where the incremental change is leading to, in this case you have the strategy of disaster scenarios in order to divert people's attention from the concrete effects of what you're doing. You know, the disaster scenario of climate change and global warming and mass migration and unemployment and flooding, in order to divert attention away from the fact that the climate treaty is a massive globalist regulatory intrusion into the lives of everyday people.
Todd, you mentioned mass migration. We're in the midst of a massive refugee crisis right now, not driven by climate, but driven by an influx of Muslim immigrants whose fundamental worldview is deeply at odds with European Enlightenment. Bring us up to date on the stresses and strains this is causing for the EU project.
Well, I think it's important to remember that what's at stake in the migrant crisis. The migrant crisis coming on top of years and years and years of Muslim immigration to Europe that has already occurred. What is at stake in the migrant crisis is the right of free peoples to perpetuate their way of life. Do the Europeans have a right to perpetuate their way of life, or do they have a moral obligation to accept mass Muslim immigration, which, if it continues, will radically change their way of life? Another thing to remember about the migrant crisis is that it's all connected with the EU's supranational global governance ideology. The EU has done away, basically, with internal borders within the EU. And EU elites have, in a certain sense, forgotten that, one, a central aspect of national sovereignty is the ability to control one's borders, and two, that it is possible to control one's borders. It is possible to enforce one's borders. And so, with this having been forgotten, it's almost not being debated in the EU whether we need to take in all of these migrants, but how and who is going to do it. And there you get the conflict between the different countries, all of whom want other countries within the EU to take more migrants than they want to take.
Great Britain has always been a reluctant player in the grand game of European integration. They were smart enough to keep their own currency and are developing an increasingly vocal anti-EU constituency. A referendum is coming up that could lead to Brexit, with the Brits taking their ball and going home. Handicap that for us.
Well, this is very, very important for the United States, the question of whether the United Kingdom will remain in Europe or not. The most recent polls seem to be saying that the British people are leaning toward remaining in Europe, but it certainly is possible, depending on what happens between now and the referendum, that they might leave Europe. If the UK does leave the European Union, that means that the United States will lose probably its closest partner within the European Union, namely Great Britain. We share a language with them, we share a history with them, we share a culture with them that's much closer than what we share with other European countries. And so the EU will become a little bit more distant from the United States if the UK leaves. That's very, very important. Also, I think if the UK leaves, the UK has always been the country in the EU that's most concerned with its national sovereignty. And so if Great Britain leaves, then the forces who believe in supranational global governance will be strengthened. They will no longer have to contend with the British, who very much wanted to slow down that process. So it would have hugely negative effect also on the European Union. But I think it's really important to remember that if we believe in self-government, then we want to respect what the British voters decide. If they decide to stay in the EU, we need to respect that. If they decide to leave the EU, we need to respect that. And that ultimately this assertion of democracy, this assertion of self-government, is a very good thing, no matter what the British people decide.
Todd, I'd like to close with your thoughts on what could be a watershed moment for Western civilization. The U.S. Constitution was established to protect citizens from despotic government and was the culmination of a trend that began with the Magna Carta. The evolving EU Constitution seems to be structured to protect the government elites from its citizens. Is this the end of democracy as we know it?
You know, that is the central difference between the U.S. Constitution and the Lisbon Treaty, which is what the EU Constitution has basically been renamed as. The Lisbon Treaty sets out what the EU can do and gives the EU more powers in almost every area. And so, yes, the purpose of the Lisbon Treaty is to give more power to the elites, to the EU, and thus less self-government to European voters. Is it the end of democracy? It's a huge threat to democracy at the very least. And I think the big threat is because the slow eroding of democracy is coming kind of on little cat feet. It's going very, very slowly, incrementally, Monet Method. And so people don't realize what's happening, and so they're not as vigilant as they should be about losing their say. But certainly, self-government in Europe has already declined tremendously in the decades since World War II, and if the EU elites have their way, it will continue to decline.
Todd, thanks for sounding a timely warning with your book, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Bill.
That was Todd Huizinga, Director of International Outreach at the Acton Institute and author of The New Totalitarian Temptations, Global Governance and the Crisis of Democracy in Europe, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Old Boston Restorations, a Victorian property management company in Boston's South End. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week when we talk to Iranian-American filmmaker Cyrus Nowrasteh and Lebanese political and cultural satirist Carl Sharrow. See you then.